Well, good evening. I'm Scott Bernstein from CNT, a member of the project team with Promise Arizona and Gould Evans, and it's a distinct pleasure to be with you here tonight to present our findings on affordability and its prospects in the South Central TOD corridor. So we're going to deal with three issues here. One, how do we know what's there currently and what's proposed will be affordable, with special reference to both housing and transportation costs? What we did to analyze the opportunities and challenges in the corridor, and what some of the key messages and findings are that we should be keeping in mind. The full set of papers is available on the Phoenix TOD website, and you can get that from the project team or from the City of Phoenix. Let's start with affordability. What is meant by affordable means different things to different people. There's an official definition, a benchmark, that you are in an affordable housing situation if your costs for housing or your community's costs on average are less than 30% of area median income. Since that number is higher than most incomes in the corridor currently, we came up with some other definitions, which we'll talk about in a minute. Something could be affordable because incomes are increasing and you have more money. But since it seems to be the case that the cost of living has been increasing faster than incomes, it's important, we believe, to both take action to increase income and reduce the cost of living if there's going to be economic success from the investments made in the South Central Corridor. So this conventional wisdom on 30% of income going for housing has a long history. There's not much science behind it. There was an old English poem that kids were taught 100 years ago in home economics classes. A week's wage for a month's rent was the last line of that poem. And now you too know where all the science is behind the rule of thumb to keep your housing costs at roughly a quarter of your income. Well, the problem with that rule of thumb today is illustrated by this chart. This is for households earning between $40,000 and $50,000 a year, which is what homeowners are earning in the South Central Corridor. They're already spending 36% or 6% more of their income on housing than the benchmark would suggest is feasible. They're also spending another place-related expense, and that's for transportation, for getting to and from that site. So those two costs together are 54%. I want to note that transportation costs at 18% are more than twice as much as healthcare costs at 8.6%. We hear a lot about the cost of healthcare. We hear very little about the cost of transportation. So the 30% rule isn't very helpful if it's already been surpassed by real conditions in the corridor. For people earning more like the average rental income of, say, $23,000 a year, if you track 10 years of cost versus income, you find that by 2016, people in the corridor were falling behind by $400 a month. So you could ask, how do they get by? And the answer is, well, they share costs, they share cars, they share homes, they take in extra borders, they have extended families. It's not necessarily the ideal situation, it's how people cope, but clearly there needs to be something here on the table that would help people reduce the cost of living if households are going to make it. Um, our organization for 20 years has analyzed what contributes to the high cost of transportation. And we find that when you look at characteristics of the neighborhood, such as density or the size of the blocks or the number of intersections per square mile or how good the transit is and where it can get you in a certain amount of time, and you compare that to household characteristics such as income, how many people are commuting to work, and how many people live in the household, they're both important, but the neighborhood characteristics explain much more of what you observe in the variation in the cost of transportation than the household characteristics would alone. So when you compare those costs to auto ownership in vehicles per household and automobile usage, which is measured in vehicle miles traveled per household per year, what's actually shown on the odometers, and you add to that the use and cost of public transportation, you can assign and estimate pretty accurately what, on average, people in a certain neighborhood are paying for total transportation costs per year. And we've done that. We've done that for every single census block group in the United States of America, 220,000 places in all. You can look at our website. It's all open source information. It's htaindex.org. So it's a mapping tool as well. And here we've mapped two of the most important features to get some key ideas across. The map on the left shows what residential densities are in households per residential acre. And in this map, the darker it is, the higher the density. The map on the right is a mirror image of that one, and wherever it's dark in the map on the left, it's light on the right. That's because in the map on the right, we're measuring automobiles per household automobiles per household owned by households in each of those places. We're actually showing Maricopa County, and so there's 2,500 places in that map. The purple line is outlining the city limits of the city of Phoenix. And that mirror image effect seems to follow the existing light rail line, and that's true. The light rail line has already had an effect on how much people spend for transportation in Phoenix. This next pair of maps is similar, but the map on the right here is measuring vehicle miles traveled per household per year. And again, it's a mirror image of density, which is a proxy for a much richer set of factors that define how compact and convenient the neighborhood is. So instead of the conventional wisdom of keeping affordability at below 30% of your income being spent on housing, we've redefined it as being 45% of income on the sum of housing and transportation. And where in Maricopa County do costs come in low enough to meet that criterion? Well, it's tricky. In this graph, we've taken all 2,500 census block groups and we've arranged the transportation costs from low to high as compared to the residential density, which goes from high to low, mirroring those mirror image maps. So you got a few hundred census block groups where you can sort of keep the transportation costs low enough, but you have several thousand where the costs are just too high. So let's take a look at what we know about where these all are, knowing that transportation costs on a neighborhood basis could be as low as 15% of area median income and as high as 34%. So what we've done here is, for the last few months, analyzed how well the corridor communities that we're calling the South Central Corridor, stretching from Lincoln and South Central down to Baseline in South Central with a half-mile circle around each one of them, are doing on a couple of key indicators related to options for building local wealth, for achieving affordability and sustainability, for taking advantage of existing public policies and recommending some new ones, and sharing the information in a form that's now available in these briefing papers. So here's some key findings and messages. First of all, with respect to housing tenure, meaning owning versus renting, costs and risks. First of all, the nature of the corridor is that 2/5 of the households in the corridor are homeowners and 3/5 are renters, or 40% and 60%. A very high percentage of the owners do not have a mortgage, which is interesting. It's good news in terms of keeping costs down. It's not so good news in terms of needing to periodically be able to get an affordable source of credit for home repair or putting an addition up or something similar, because those are done through usually home equity lines of credit, and to do that, you have to have a first mortgage. Renter income is very low. We found that 20% of the rental units are in trailer parks with a very heavy concentration of the total down south of Baseline Road. And these conditions all lend themselves to potential gentrification and displacement pressures. It's possible to think of the corridor as being in sort of a fragile situation, and any of these influences could make it difficult for people to afford to stay in their homes in the corridor. So how do we know when it's affordable? Let's take a look at what's there. So first of all, it's a corridor of 2,240 homeowners and 3,298 renters. This chart shows what the ratios are of renters to owners for each of the stations. So we have Lincoln, Buckeye, Audubon, Broadway, Roser, Southern, and Baseline Avenues. With the exception of the situation at Baseline and Central, there are more persons living per household in the owner-occupied than in the renter-occupied dwellings. Occupancy is anywhere from 2.5 to 5 people per household, and you can see what the variation is here uh, in these homes. It's the nature of the legacy of the corridor as a Mexican American and Hispanic port of entry, if you will, and the traditions in those communities and the tendency towards extended families to have larger households. And indeed, these are larger numbers than for Phoenix as a whole. But the trends are towards smaller households, and we'll get to that in a minute. So let's talk about affordability now and try and answer the question directly. What percentage of household income goes to pay the sum of both housing and transportation costs by station area? And here we've answered the question by breaking the sum of those two costs out for owners in blue and renters in orange, again for each station area, and then in this case for the areas total. In total, owners are paying about 42 to 50% of their occupancy costs for the summer housing and transportation. So many of them actually do meet our recommended affordability criterion, but that's only because the incomes are relatively so much higher for owners than for renters. Rental income is very low, and those ranges are from 50% of income all the way up to 81% at Audubon, slightly below that at Southern, with an average of about 67%. Between two-thirds and three-fourths of all income for renters in the corridor are going to pay the sum of these two costs, leaving only 33% or less to pay all other costs of living for food, medical care, clothing, and so forth. So this is a tight situation. You might ask, why then are the transportation costs so high in the corridor, and what might be done about that? Let's drill down a little more deeply. I'm going to show a series of comparable maps now for each of the 7 station areas, and I'm going to keep them comparable by holding constant the type of household that we're looking at. In this case, this was analyzed for a single parent family with one female head of household, 3 people total in the household. The head of household is working, and the total income is $27,011 a year. That household at Lincoln is paying 36% of their income for housing, 20% for transportation, and a total of 56% of their income for housing and transportation. They only own one vehicle. They drive at 10,300 miles a year. They're taking a little bit over one transit trip per week, and it's what it costs. So you can see the numbers, $9,700 a year for housing, $5,400 for transportation, They're not necessarily splurging, but they don't have much money and they're renting. So that's Lincoln. Same numbers for Buckeye, 34% for housing, 25% for transportation, 59% total. They own more cars per household. They drive them more often. They're taking less transit there. At Audubon, the numbers are quite a bit higher, 42% for housing, 28% for transportation. The location affordability is 70% for the sum of housing and transportation. And here we can see what some of the patterns are, that the housing itself is more expensive and the location of the neighborhood is less convenient. And those two factors play into the higher vehicle ownership and, uh, and higher odometer readings per year. At Broadway, the numbers are 42 and 28%, so 70% again. At Roser, it's 38 and 25, or 63% of income. At Southern, it's 41 and 30, or 71% of income. And at Baseline, it's 42% for housing, 27% for transportation, and a sum total of 18,600 a year, or 69% for location affordability, unaffordability, as it turns out. So that's pretty tight. That's the nature of what it costs renters in particular to pay for these costs uh, living in the South Central corridor. The housing is inexpensive compared to the region as a whole, and yet because they're so income constrained and because they don't think about the cost of transportation when they're trying to score how affordable is this house, they find themselves in sort of a trap where they're stuck paying for these two costs that add up to a very high percentage of income. A second set of key messages are about accessibility, which we measured in terms of a term we invented, location efficiency. And in English, a place is location efficient if it's both locally convenient and regionally connected. And it's important to look at both because only 20% of the trips taken by households in Phoenix are for getting to and from work. 80%, fully 4 out of 5 trips are for shopping, services, getting to and from school, recreation, going to houses of worship, or visiting. Here's what we know about how people get to work. The census asks the question every year, how did you get to work last year? What we find is that the biggest set of answers to that question is drove alone to work, and yet it was only 58% of the total people answering, of the 7,018 workers who commute living in the corridor, drove alone to work. 42% did not, instead taking the options that they had. And those options were carpooling, they taking transit, bicycling, walking, taxi, motorcycle, and interestingly, a growing fraction working from home or telecommuting. And so you can see that it's not true, which we've heard quite a bit, that everybody drives alone to work, but rather that a lot of people need to drive alone to work and a lot of other people do not, and they're taking that choice. You can also see that as you get closer to downtown, that people are taking more of the options that are available, including over 11% working from home at Lincoln. And and as you get further out, more people are driving and carpooling. And that's just the nature of the transit system. It'll change as the light rail comes online, but at the moment, that's what the distribution was as of 2017. A key message is that transit already provides regional jobs access that will improve considerably with the new LRT service. If you look at how many jobs you can reach within a 30-minute transit commute, it ranges anywhere from 182,000 at Baseline and Central all the way up to 361,000 at Lincoln and South Central. So the light rail and connecting bus service does a pretty good job of reaching a majority of the job centers in the region, but perhaps not the majority of the jobs that this set of workers need to reach. First of all, there's a mismatch between skills and job opportunities right in the corridor itself. If you draw a half-mile rectangle around the center line of South Central Avenue, you find there's over 44,000 jobs in the study area, but of the 7,500 workers living in that rectangle, only 641 jobs out of that 44,000 are held by workers who live there. So they're having to commute out. There's a skills mismatch. The fastest growing jobs are in categories that require training in what you might think of as tech skills, the kind of training not that you need a college degree for, but perhaps a community college associate arts degree or an advanced on-the-job training certification from a nonprofit training program would do it. And those can be done, and this may be an opportunity to improve incomes in the corridor by focusing the competencies of Phoenix's excellent training programs on workers in the corridor. Now, South Phoenix itself is not generally thought of as a jobs and business center. Here's a map of job centers in the city of Phoenix, and wherever those dark blue purple colors are is where you see the greatest numbers of jobs. So you can see that for the corridor itself, it's only at the north end on the edge of downtown where you see a noticeable concentration of jobs. I've put the red arrow at the bottom down at baseline in South Central, and yet as a linear corridor, if you could show this, 44,000 jobs already is a respectable job center. So once the light rail is in operating every few minutes, in effect, it's a high frequency line, it would be possible to market the area both as a jobs destination and as a point of origin for workers who could be holding those jobs or jobs nearby or jobs more accessible by transit. And so that's one possible way to think about marketing the assets of the corridor once the light rail goes in. Now let's look station by station again at businesses and employees. Here we've drawn a half-mile circle around Lincoln and South Central. Within that, there's 208 businesses or employers, which might be public agencies, over 17,000 employees. Those are mostly located to the north of that circle, and the sectors that those jobs are in are largely public administration services and wholesale trade. At Buckeye, we have 81 businesses with just 2,000 employees, so a smaller number of employees per business, and they're not concentrated anywhere in particular. They're dispersed rather evenly along some of the roads uh, within that half-mile area, and so it's dispersed, and the concentrations there are in healthcare, warehousing, and utilities. At Audubon and South Central, by contrast, that large purple colored area there is representing 46 businesses or employers with 2,600 employees. They're mostly in manufacturing and distribution, and they're clustered to the south and to the east. And it's manufacturing does provide a good wage and a large value added, and it's worth better understanding who the supply chains are for those manufacturers. There may be something that's quite sustainable there in terms of paying attention to these are jobs that people can be trained for. At Broadway, we have just 40 businesses with 901 jobs, but and a large concentration of them are in the public sector. But in the bottom half of that circle, we start to see something more like an urban concentration, more of a Main Street kind of character along South Central, North and South. And that continues on into the half-mile circle centered on Roser in South Central. There's 49 businesses or employers with 1,000 employees clustered in retail and public sector employment. And again along South Central, continuing to the south along Southern, you can see the same sort of pattern with 61 businesses, 1,300 employees, again, public administration, education, and retail clustered in the center and the north along South Central. And finally, at baseline, we see not only a continuation of that pattern, but what I think of as an improvement. This is the one station where you have both north-south and east-west business concentration along both baseline and South Central. So 48 businesses, over 1,300 employees, and in healthcare, food services, retail, and education. Um, Now, we've been talking about how people get to work. It's sort of an outbound. Where can you get to from these neighborhoods? But transit runs both ways. So transit also provides car-free shopper and patron access to local businesses and amenities. So at Baseline Road, it's almost 47,000 customers can already reach uh, those those retail businesses within 30 minutes on the current bus network. This will be magnified tremendously. It's 90,000 at Lincoln. This could grow to be 2 to 3 times the customer base that could commute in once the light rail is running. So it could be, as a vision, that South Central becomes more of a destination. There's no shortage of room to grow businesses along South Central and along cross streets. The zoning is already in place to encourage that. The current residents spend approximately $262 million a year, which mostly leaves the area. If you were able to think of the corridor as a destination and went out 2 miles instead of a half mile from the center line, that spending grows to $1.9 billion. It's mostly being spent in more distant shopping centers and malls. Again, very little in the corridor. Uh, and it could be that the plan, if executed properly, captures a large fraction of that. Much like we said, you could think of South Central as a jobs corridor as well. Another set of key messages about walkability and livability, about having a healthy, friendly, safe, and connected place. Now, there's problems in Phoenix. Phoenix, for over 2 decades, has been in the top 10 list of cities nationally for pedestrian deaths per year. Another issue is it's hot and getting hotter, and the lack of shade raises temperature in paved areas almost everywhere. Very unhealthful. Um, we have low density, long blocks, under-maintained sidewalks and lighting, which make walking less desirable. These points all, by the way, came out quite clearly in the very large household survey that Promise Arizona has been conducting, going door to door. And people consistently want to know, they want assurances that out of the TOD planning and the light rail implementation and the associated TOD implementation, that all areas will become walkable, not just a few small oases. It could be that one could think of the corridor, in fact, as a potential oasis from all of these problems if we get this right. When we did similar planning a few years back in Chicago, we noted that we had similar feedback from people in Chicago neighborhoods. When asked, what would it take for your street to be complete? They said stormwater management, energy efficiency, water use efficiency, alternative transportation, recycling services, cooler areas by urban heat island mitigation, reflecting away more of the heat rather than absorbing it. They talked about beauty and community, about better sites, and about more healthful air quality. So I think people have a pretty good innate sense of what it takes to have complete streets. I want to focus on just one factor here that I think you can do something about. So what we've done here is we've highlighted the outline of the streets surrounding each block, around each station. And we've measured how long the perimeter, the distance around each block is. You noticed here at Lincoln and South Central the pattern of very small 4 to 5 acre blocks with around a 500-meter perimeter, 1,500 feet or something you could do in 5 or 6 minutes. And a similar sort of pattern at Buckeye. And both of these, you notice also that it's possible to just keep walking east, west, and north, south with very little interruption throughout the map until you get further away from the corridor. At Audubon, it's very different. Those blocks that are laid out as blocks are long and narrow. The average block perimeter is 1,239 meters, which is the better part of a mile. It's too long to walk around the block. It's too long for the people who live there to get to the few amenities that are there, and this encourages high driving behavior, and that's one of several reasons why the transportation costs were as high as we saw in the previous slides. At Broadway, we get more of a connected pattern, but we still have almost 700 meters to walk around the block. And some of those blocks have more suburban than urban form. It's just too far. You literally, in some cases, can't walk next door because the streets and the sidewalks won't let you do it. At Roser, it's almost 900 meters. At Southern, it's almost 1,200 meters. These are not human scale blocks. These are made for driving. And at Baseline and South Central, almost 900 meters again. Finally, we reviewed development influences and challenges in four areas. What's it take to do development without displacement of the current population and businesses? What are the demographic trends we can take advantage of? What's it take to retain friends and family members in the area? And what actions are there that can be taken that help these households beat the rising cost of living? So first, a comment about urban form in Phoenix. There's a belief that almost everything in a place like Chicago is in tall buildings. Well, overwhelmingly, Chicago is a 2 and 3 story town. That's those orange and gray curves. And you'll notice that whether it's the Twin Cities, a very different place, or Seattle or Atlanta, most of the housing is in 2 to 3 story format. Only in New York City do you see a predominance of higher buildings to the extent most people associate with it, and that's mostly in Manhattan. On average, the height's 6 stories in the city of New York, 3 stories in Chicago, 2 to 3 stories elsewhere. Now in Phoenix, it's closer to 2 stories, and 61% of the residential units are in single family format, which means that 39% are not. And if you look at the distribution of residential units by the number of units per building, you see that it's also the case that 61% of the units are in single family detached housing. Only 10% of the units are in single family attached or townhouse housing or 2 to 4 unit buildings, a little over 6% in 5 to 9 unit buildings, 8% in 10 to 19 unit buildings, 10% in 20 units or more, a very high 3.2% in mobile homes, an affordable form of housing. So when people talk about the missing middle housing, it's mostly that second category there, either townhomes or 2 to 4 unit buildings, and there's room for that. There's room for that in Phoenix, and there's certainly room for that in the corridor. Phoenix is not immune to the general change in the demographic distribution in the United States. In 1960, only 40% of households existed that had only one or two persons in them. By last year, 2018, that had grown to 63% of the total. Now that's Phoenix is starting to approach that as a whole. You still have larger household distribution than that in the corridor. But as we think about growing the population in the corridor, I would recommend that there be some sensitivity to the two fastest growing demographic groups, which are younger households, so-called millennials, and people like me, aging baby boomers who can't get over the habit of getting older and who don't need a larger house all to themselves. And so there's room to grow people within housing, and some of that's going on already in South Central. There's also room, frankly, to build a larger number of smaller units that would allow for family members to live nearby as an alternative to living within the existing units of housing as well. And it's a very interesting trend and very important. And frankly, it's what's driving investors to think positively about transit-oriented development at all sorts of price ranges because it's easier to get those higher densities I talked about and lower driving dependence when you have larger numbers of smaller units than you see now in South Central. Now, that's not the pattern that's there right now. Only at Roser do we have a small number of single-family detached dwellings, 31%. Everywhere else it's 60 to 64, except for Lincoln and Broadway, which are 84 and 85% single-family detached housing. So one observation is that shared housing is an affordability strategy. Two can live cheaper than one. People bring kids back home for a while when they can't get a job. Aging family members allow people to more or less age in place or age with families. Um, Formalizing approval for empty nesters or near empty nesters and others to rent rooms would be a very affordable strategy. And if the city could encourage that and people felt comfortable with it, it might be the least cost strategy to getting started to growing the population and helping people get more income in the bargain. Phoenix could also lead an effort to streamline approval for so-called accessory units, converting garages or building small units on existing home parcels. There's been a lot of advance in that, and in all these cases, you can get density without necessarily creating much of a change in the built footprint within the area. Um, we also studied changes that, if not paid attention to, could lead to gentrification, which means a rapid increase in income, or displacement, which means the loss of occupancy. And those include increases in median family income and educational attainment, average housing costs, diversity, um, the percentage of people living below poverty, the percentage of single female headed households, and how quickly rents are rising compared to incomes. So the immediate concern is rents rising faster than income, which is happening pretty much in all those blue areas along and beside the corridor. Near-term concerns are gentrification due to the extra factors that I'm talking about. So um, it's possible to have gentrification be good. Gentrification means more income for local residents, and those residents in turn will be able to spend more money at local businesses. But as incomes go up, it's likely that assessed values will go up, taxes will go up, and the need for city services will go up. And one way or another, those costs may spill over onto those least able to afford it. And then there's this conundrum of rising number of owners without mortgages, which makes home improvement credit expensive. And here we're showing the change in that from 2010 to 2017. And it's the most immediate concern, as is rents rising faster than income in the northern third of this corridor. And that's not surprising since that's the third closest to downtown, but I think it means that there should be some attention paid to how to help people get by as homeowners and do what they need to keep their homes up. We identified a set of 7 near-term actions to develop responsibly. One is to set up some sort of land acquisition fund to protect existing residents and ensure that development occurs responsibly. This is happening all over the country, and it should be a popular idea here. I believe it's been discussed with several of the community organizations that are planning for the future of South Central. You could start working with Valley Metro to help employers provide transit passes affordably to boost use of this valuable asset, and also to explore with community organizations in Valley Metro creating a similar transit pass program on a community level. In the first case, employers can offer transit as a pre-tax benefit, much like healthcare, and human resources directors know how to do that. It just needs to be marketed. In the second case, it would be an experimental program. In Boulder, Colorado, where they've been experimenting with it. 61% of the households now have one or more year-long prepaid discounted transit passes. If you want to understand that one, imagine a future advertisement for a small apartment that says $700 a month, includes utilities and transit pass, and you get the idea. A fourth one is to boost walkability and local business viability together. Removing pedestrian and bike barriers would help patronage at those businesses and make South Central a test bed and model for healthy, livable places citywide. As we mentioned, you can target skills training to area residents. You can also work to plan and create South Central as a destination and preferred location for jobs and activities. And finally, you can start planning to return more anchor institutions to South Phoenix. The area is without any hospitals right now and has only a modest number of educational anchors. It's good news that ASU has set up a college prep program, but much more is needed. Um, Speaking with the president of the community college, I think there's interest there in working creatively together on this front. So can this happen? Do we have evidence it's happened in other places? Here's two cases where Hispanic communities with similar incomes basically worked with the city, took charge, and something very special emerged. You're looking at an image of the Fruitvale Transit Village in Oakland, California, developed by the Spanish-speaking Unity Council over a period of years. They converted an 11-acre parking lot to an initial 47 units of housing. They're building another 94 now, and next year they're starting another 181. Um, they've already built 24 retail stores, plus a library, plus a health center, plus a senior center. It looks gorgeous. I've tried this with audiences. When you ask them to guess what's the income of the people living there, they assume it's luxury housing we're looking at, but actually these are affordable units for lower income households. They had a big role in the design. You can see the festive nature of the place. You could imagine a number of these types of station areas getting built in South Central Phoenix. In Boyle Heights in East LA, the community groups came together in response to perceived gentrification and displacement risks there. Working with the city and the transit agency, they adopted a goal of development without displacement around a subway station, which is centered on something that was informally called Mariachi Plaza. It's now formally Mariachi Plaza. It's designated with community designed artwork, statuary, a bandstand. They preserved all the existing surrounding businesses, the traditional and locally owned ones. And as you can see from this table of four pictures, as you walk around it, what you see is kind of what we've been talking about here. In the lower left-hand corner, the traditional businesses are across the street from the subway entrance and the new band shell. To the right, they modified the shape of the plaza to preserve another row of those traditionally owned businesses. In the upper right, the entrance to the subway is an Aztec-themed bird that is semi-transparent using stained glass. So when the sun is the highest and the hottest, the coolest space in the plaza in more ways than one is under that overhang, and it's beautiful. You're standing under a rainbow. The one area, the one side of the plaza that had vacant land available is where mixed use, mixed income housing got put in, and that's the sun shining on it. It only looks like a flying saucer. So we could come up with other examples from Chicago and New York City and the Twin Cities, but it's being done in a number of places in the name of equitable transit-oriented development. We think there's a really great shot at doing this in South Central, and we've been happy to contribute to this effort as a member of the Promise Arizona and Gould Evans team working for the city of Phoenix, working to help inform the public engagement process and preparing the briefing papers, which you now have available. Thank you very much.